My name is Carlo Mendez, and I worked the night shift at Lakeview Mall for 8 months. I took the job because it was quiet. 4 floors, 200 stores, all of them locked and dark by 10. By midnight, the only sounds were the hum of the escalators on standby and my own footsteps echoing off the polished tiles. I was never the type to scare easily. I had done 2 years in a warehouse before this, another year doing rounds at a hospital. Empty buildings were familiar to me. They never felt threatening. They just felt empty. That changed on a Tuesday in November. I was on my second sweep of the night, 3rd floor, heading toward the east wing. Everything was normal. The stores were shuttered, the corridor lights dimmed to half power like they always were after hours, and the mall had that hollow, sealed feeling it got when no one else was around. I was about to turn back toward the stairwell when I heard it. A voice, faint, muffled, coming from somewhere ahead of me. I stopped and stood still. The sound was directional, coming from the left side of the hallway. I turned toward it and immediately knew where it was coming from. The men's comfort room, 20 meters ahead, its door slightly ajar with the interior dark. I told myself it was probably a drunk who had gotten locked inside before closing. It happened sometimes. Someone would fall asleep in a cubicle and the cleaning crew would miss them on the way out. That was the logical explanation, and I held on to it as I walked toward the door and pushed it open. I called out before entering. I announced myself, said I was security, asked if anyone needed help. No response. I stepped inside and hit the light switch. The fluorescent tubes buzzed and flickered before settling into full brightness. I looked down the row of cubicles. All the doors were open, pushed back against the walls. I walked the length of the room anyway, checking each one. Empty. The last cubicle at the far end had its door hanging at a slight angle, like the hinge was loose, and when the air conditioning cycled on, it moved just barely, a slow drift back and forth. I stood there for a moment and listened. Nothing. Just the ventilation and the low buzz of the lights overhead. I was almost at the exit when I heard it again. It was closer this time, not from behind me, not from inside a cubicle. It was coming from the wall to my right, from somewhere just beyond the tiles, low and strained, the way a voice sounds when someone is trying to be heard through a closed door. A single word, repeated twice. Help. Help. I turned and looked at the wall. There was nothing there. No door, no access panel, no visible gap in the surface, just flat white tiles running from floor to ceiling. I pressed my hand against them and felt nothing, no vibration, no hollow sound when I knocked. I stood there for longer than I should have, my hand still flat against the wall, trying to convince myself that sound traveled strangely in enclosed spaces, that I was probably picking up something from another part of the building. A television left on in one of the back rooms. A radio, anything. Then the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a slow fade. All at once, the entire room went completely dark, and for a moment, I couldn't even see the outline of the exit door. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. The beam swept across the row of cubicles, the sinks, the mirrors along the far wall. In the mirror, the beam caught my own reflection, pale and sharp against the darkness behind me. And behind my reflection, at the very edge of the light, something was standing in the last cubicle. I turned around immediately. The cubicle door was still. The flashlight held steady on it. Nothing moved. I told myself I had seen a shadow, a trick of the angle in the glass. I told myself that firmly, out loud, so I could hear my own voice in the silence. I left without checking again. I let the door swing shut behind me and stood in the corridor under the dim half-power lights and waited until my breathing evened out. The hallway was empty in both directions. The mall was quiet. Everything looked exactly as it had before, but I could not make myself write it down in the log as nothing. When I got back to the guard station, I sat at the desk for a long time before I finally opened the report sheet. I wrote that I had done the sweep. I wrote that all areas were clear. I did not write about the voice. I did not write about what I saw in the mirror. I finished that shift and every shift after it, but I never used that comfort room again. I told the other guards it was a personal thing, that I preferred the one on the ground floor. None of them asked why. Maybe they already knew. My name is Adrienne Velasco, and I have worked at a logistics warehouse for almost 3 years. In that time, nothing unusual ever happened. Trucks came in, boxes got scanned, stacked, and shipped out. The routine was so consistent that after a while I stopped thinking about the work at all. I just did it. That was why I didn't think much of staying late that Friday when the rest of the team had already gone home. There were boxes to restack in storage, and someone had to finish them. It made sense that it would be me. By the time I got to it, it was past midnight. The warehouse feels different at night, bigger than it does during the day, and quieter in a way that makes small sounds carry further than they should. The hum of the overhead lights, the faint creak of the metal shelving somewhere toward the back. I noticed all of it in a way I normally wouldn't have, and I told myself that was just what happened when a building emptied out and there was nothing else to occupy your attention. I grabbed the pallet jack and headed toward the storage area. That was when I saw him, a man in the same uniform as mine, reflective vest and gloves and cap pulled low, already carrying a box toward the storage door. I called out and said I hadn't known anyone else was still there. He didn't respond. He walked past me and went inside, and a few seconds later he came back out empty-handed, picked up another box, and headed back in without a word. I said thanks and told him it would go faster with 2 of us. He didn't acknowledge that either. Something about his silence bothered me, but the boxes were getting moved, and I told myself he probably hadn't heard me or simply wasn't the type to talk, so I let it go and kept working. We fell into a rhythm after that. I stacked near the entrance, and he carried deeper inside. He moved without hesitation and without wasted motion, the way someone moves when they have done a job so many times that the body carries out the steps before the mind even registers them. The pile shrank quickly. Eventually, there was only 1 box left. He reached it before I did, paused for just a moment, then carried it through the storage door. I waited for him to come back out. After 30 seconds, I called into the room and asked if he was all right. There was no answer. I walked to the door and looked inside. Rows of boxes on both sides, neatly arranged, the air completely still. I walked every aisle and checked every corner. The storage area was empty. When I looked at the last stack, the final box was already in place. I stood there for a while, trying to find a reasonable explanation. I thought about the layout of the room and whether there was some exit I had overlooked, some panel or back door I hadn't noticed in 3 years of working there. I couldn't think of one. There was one way in and one way out, and I had been standing in front of it the entire time. I walked back to the office and tried to sound casual when I told my boss that someone else had been helping me in storage. He looked up and said no one else had stayed late. I described what I had seen, and he listened without saying much, and when I finished, he didn't respond right away. I noticed the wall beside his desk while I was waiting for him to speak. A row of framed photos, all of them labeled top employees. One of the faces stopped me. Same uniform, same cap, the same calm, focused expression. I told my boss that was the man. He came over and looked at the photo for a long moment, and when he turned back to me, his expression had shifted into something I couldn't quite read. He told me the man's name was Ramon. He said Ramon had been one of the best workers they had ever had, that he always stayed late and always made sure every job was finished before he left. He paused before continuing. 5 years ago, he said, on a night much like this one, Ramon had stayed behind alone to finish a late delivery. He was restacking boxes in the storage area when one of the upper racks gave way and brought the load down on top of him. No one found him until the following morning. After that, he said some of the workers started hearing movement in storage during late shifts, like someone's still inside, still working. They had always put it down to the building settling. I looked at the photo again. I looked at it for a long time. I still work there. I just don't take late shifts anymore. And when I do have to pass the storage door, I always slow down without meaning to, the same way you slow down near something you can't quite explain and haven't been able to let go of. The boxes were finished that night, every one of them in place. I've never been able to decide whether that makes it better or worse. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I worked the night shift at a city morgue for 2 years. In that time, nothing ever felt out of place. Death became routine, silence became normal, and the idea of anything supernatural never once crossed my mind. I had seen too many bodies, too many empty faces, to believe in anything lingering after life left a person. That was why I ignored the feeling when the call came in just before midnight. They brought her in from the woods. Suspected homicide, no identification, no records yet. Just another Jane Doe, except something felt different the moment she arrived. The air turned colder in a way I couldn't explain, not the usual chill from the storage units, but something heavier pressing in around me. I pushed the thought aside and did my job. I tagged her, logged the time, and wheeled her down the hallway. When I slid her into the drawer and shut it, the lights above me flickered twice before settling again. I stood there for a second, then shook it off and walked back to the office. When I reached my desk, I froze. The tag was sitting there, neatly placed in the center of the table, the same tag I had just attached to the body. I stared at it, turning it over in my hands, telling myself I must have forgotten to secure it properly. I was about to head back and fix it when I heard something. A voice, faint and distant, that sounded like it said, "Help." I stopped and listened. The room went completely still, and for a moment there was nothing except the low hum of the building and my own breathing. Then I heard it again, softer but clearer. I forced myself to stay rational. If I was hearing something, there had to be an explanation. Maybe someone had slipped inside, a family member desperate to see the body. That made far more sense than anything else, so I stepped out and followed the direction of the sound. When I reached the storage area, I noticed the drawer immediately. It was slightly open, a gap where there shouldn't have been one. I pulled it open and looked inside. She was still there, exactly where I had left her. I exhaled slowly, attached the tag properly, and pushed the drawer shut. The voice was gone. I told myself it was fatigue, a long shift, too little sleep. That explanation felt safe, and I held on to it as I turned and walked back toward the office. Halfway down the hallway, one of the overhead lights began to flicker. The rest of the corridor stayed lit, but that single bulb pulsed on and off in a slow rhythm, and when it cut out the first time, I saw her. A tall figure standing at the far end of the hallway, completely still. When the light came back on, she was gone. The light flickered again, and when the darkness returned, the shape was back, only closer than before. I stood there unable to move, watching her appear and disappear with each pulse, her outline growing clearer every time the bulb cut out. The tilt of her head and the unnatural stillness of her body becoming more defined with every second. Then the light stayed off longer than it had before, and in that moment of darkness, I felt it. Not at the end of the hallway, right there beside me, close enough that I could feel the air shift. When the light came back on, the hallway was empty, but the feeling didn't leave. Something in me broke. I turned and ran without looking back, straight through the halls and out the exit, not stopping until the cold night air hit me all at once. I never went back. I never worked another night shift in a place like that again. Because even now, years later, the thought of standing alone under flickering lights in an empty hallway is enough to bring that feeling back. The certainty that something was standing in the dark right beside me, waiting for the lights to go out.